Good morning. Uh, Welcome. So, my name is Prasad, uh, and welcome to the sixth cycle of what we call thesis symposium of the School of Environment and Architecture. The I mean, this has been one of the most important events of C since the past 6 years or so, and this is the sixth cycle, the sixth final year of the school, and uh, and joining us today are these two scholars. I will introduce them in a moment. Uh, Sonal Mittal from Ahmedabad and Kush Patel from Bangalore. Uh, since the first cycle, since the beginning of C, which is 10 years ago, I think the one of the uh, one of the key things about about the thesis course has been to establish relationship between space, spatiality, spatial configuration, and life. I think that is something which we've been kind of focusing on, and that has been the inquiry for a long time, and recognizing very well that this is not an empirically decipherable relationship, because it has complex. I mean, what the intermediary between space and life is this are these very complex subjectivities, so 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 depending upon what kind of historical self, instinctual self you are, the space kind of uh, you experience and you practice space in that way. So it's not a very decipherable, empirically decipherable this process. And what we do is we've been doing this as a collaboration between students themselves with teachers. They both kind of, because there is very little material, so to say, to kind of about this relationship. There are people doing behavioral sciences and these kind of works, but then we realize that it's actually not enough, because there are so many. I mean, you overlay the dimension of gender, caste, disability, the whole thing kind of changes. Subjectivities are keep they're unstable, actually. It's evolving. So how do you then hold it, and what is a so we use a lot of for the last 5 years we've been experimenting with drawings, with thick interviews, with uh, uh, sensory kind of modes of experiencing space, looking at routines, looking at a whole variety of things. And it has taken us time to articulate this relationship. I think it will take us 4 or 5 more years to kind of uh, hold it with some authority. Uh, I mean, we know the physical science and social science methods are limited to understand space. I mean, this is very clear. Uh, this year and last year we were. I mean, last year was an interesting year, because last year we said that our exploration has moved into fully drawing space. At least we know the language. How do you kind of deal with space? Drawing doesn't limit itself to actually drawing diagrams, or but it also text, and it's drawing out. uh, this year I think one thing is very clear, that a close looking into the thicknesses of life, I think is very important, and you'll see one presentation of the and after the other, how this close looking at the thickness actually kind of you know helps us open up this dimension of space. And that and the thickness is actually in very soft, you know, it's in whispers and glances and nudges. It's not a very clear thing, but it's, and you'll see that in various uh, 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 works actually. So we are interested in thicknesses, in narratives. We are interested in uh, slow reading, slow listening, and a variety of, soft forms of understanding space. And that's how we want to go about it. So this year's Space Beside Itself is an assertion of this, this ways of approaching space, really, uh, from a non-empirical, but also, you know, I wouldn't, I mean, I don't want to hesitate, but it's a non-colonial way of, looking at things also. So, so, and just one more thing about, because Sonal is coming here for the first time. It's not a review. It's more of a conversation. So they, each one of them will present for 10 minutes, 12 minutes, and then we have an interaction. It's a way to kind of, we I mean, they are in their fifth year, so they're almost, everybody is equal. So, and there's a lot of things that every year these works kind of open up. So it's a discussion on ideas to open up and further the ideas, rather than kind of, looking at it, evaluating it. And again, continuing with what I said, it's on memory and architecture. And you have people moving from Karachi in case of Kushbu, from Jaipur in case of um, Anika, and Aditi's from Sinnar to Sinnar, Jaipur to Bombay, and Sindh to Jalgaon. And it's a Anika, I remember your name. You're just jet lagged now, so it's kind of so. And memory, though it's very ephemeral, it's kind of, it's not something which you hold very clearly. It doesn't have a shape or form, but it's one of the key factors shaping space. And this is something which has come so often. And all three of them will mobilize a narrative method, a way of kind of approaching this question around memory and space. And I'll invite Anika, not the first Anika, to kind of, yeah, I have to introduce both of you also. I mean, it's because Kush has been coming for last 6 years, and because I'm reading your books the last 4 days, I feel so familiar with you also. So Kush Patel, I should read. So Kush Patel is based in Bangalore and currently heads the Contemporary Art Practice Masters of Arts program at Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology. Uh, Kush, uh, Kush is interested in the digital humanities, the gender question, and uh, the first time I met Kush was in at Avani, and it's quite interesting because Avni is this school built by architects with capital A, no? And Kush is trying to kind of live his life there and work his ways out. And he did this urban studies course, uh, where, which was so close to what we were trying to do over here also. And since then he's been a very close friend. Uh, there is one more thing I need to mention is, uh, I mean, the the establishment of the Just Future collab is something which he established in Srishti, at Srishti. Sonal Mittal is an architect, artist, and educator. She holds a doctorate from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She's studied at Delhi and also from Lucknow University. Uh, she's she's the co-founder of research and conservation studio People for Heritage Concern, which offers consultancy for conservation and urban revitalization projects and art projects for the public sector. She's serving as the chair of the Masters in Conservation and Regeneration program at CEPT University. Her research, teaching, and writing transacts architecture, landscape architecture, queer studies, history, and architectural conservation. She's recently published a book which we will discuss tomorrow evening, and uh, I think for an for being an architectural book, I think it's one of the seminal shifts in the way it is written. Actually, I think we'll discuss it more, and it's quite interesting. So it's an honor for us that both of you are here. Thank you so much. So we'll start the first panel. Anika, you start. Thanks.
Yeah. Hello everyone. My thesis is titled Remembering Ghar, Continuities of Memory. If one were to ask what part of the home is remembered or what part of it remains, what would it be? When I think of the older home, I vividly remember a house unfolding amidst a chaotic array of objects scattered around the house. These memories, rooted in specific places and experiences, suggest that the ghar that gets remembered isn't a complete thing. It's an idea formed from a collection of spaces and practices that informs the way of living. The thesis argues that the remembered home persists in the inhabited home and shapes its space and forms of living. Which brings me to my question: how do spaces and practices of the remembered home produce a spatiality that blurs the inhabitation of a particular type? To set up the framework of the research, I undertook a few readings which opened up certain ideas to me. What is memory? Memory doesn't become a linear narrative in the way that it gets remembered. The act of remembering creates this web of connections, linking the objects, scenes, and events, bringing past moments. To remember thus becomes a process of drawing associations. What is continuity of home? The home becomes not a static form but continuously adapts itself and reshapes itself through the memories and meanings we project onto it. The idea of mapping home through spatial and practices is thus tied to this continuity of memory. The thesis aims to demonstrate how recollections of former dwelling spaces shape the space and idea of the inhabited home. It is undertaken by collecting interviews from 3 different households who have shifted their residence space and have shaped the space and idea of home in Mumbai and Jaipur. The first case of the Alas and Chalk, where Asha, a woman in her early 60s, and her family recollect images and stories of the two homes they lived in the Pink City, named Gunniso Gunnis and 1810. The method for the field involved going to their homes and having conversations, meeting back and forth, visiting the old home as it was accessible here. The documentation of the spaces of the remembered home and the new home with the help of notes, plans, and sections helped in localizing memories that emerged from the specific ways of inhabiting the type. The material archive here becomes important. Photos taken from the album that the interlocutor shared generously, photos that I was able to take of their spaces, the notes that were written on these, which became important because of how they launched from the images of space. All of these necessitated a form of drawing that was able to hold these at the center and unfold the memory from them. The study undertakes a drawing method launching from these collected photos as partial anchors and reconstructing the remembered home and current home around. The method involves completing the photograph with drawings that bring together fragments of the space, certain objects, routines, and anecdotes that the interlocutor recalls, suggesting the nature of memory. The house is drawn, not in a form that produces a straightforward telling of its partial organization, but rather as vantages that unfold in many ways. The spaces of the home are thus seen as a series of places built through adjacencies, not just of space, but of moments, experiences, and anecdotes. Goodness so goodness Makan. Asha lived most of her life with a family in the neighborhood of Sukhlal Vyaski Gully in the Pink City, surrounded by the work of Thateras, that are the utensil makers. Waiting for the shared toilet, limited among so many people, became a time for interaction as members gathered in the morning. A baranda on the above floors, wrapped around the chalk where Bikaner Wali and Asha would sit to wash utensils. The street, as she remembers, was very thin with the houses facing it. बजरी की ट्रक भी रास्ते पे रुक जाती थी. Here she writes down recalling, यहाँ पर बर्तन पर तेजाब लगाते थे तो उसकी अजीब सी बदबू आती थी. When they moved to 1810 in the same neighborhood, they entered a Guwadi, which is a cluster. Although it lacked an internal chalk, however, the arrangement of the houses facing each other resembled the chalk in the Gunniso Gunnis Makan. Sat Rajput or Teen Thatere, she draws a quick sketch of it. She recollects that there were more alas which were closed as they ended up getting cluttered. Her room held the collective nature of the household, while upstairs the rooms had the cupboards placed outside. Bhumika recollects the Thatera right up opposite her window. House in the city outskirts. Before COVID, they moved to the current home where the hall becomes a multifunctional space, but the reminiscent Jali also find its own place in the corner. Asha's room, with both the doors left open, holds the collective nature of a ground floor room in 1810, which affords for interchange of furniture. The interchange thus blurs the distinct boundaries typically set out by the house's layout and helps one claim the type. Certain spatial practices, like the mandir and the ala, but now with kivards, continue. Previously scattered objects are now clustered to have an aesthetic of the type. The new type confines Bhumika to her room, contradicting her routine in 1810. The home is further softened as the family consults the local carpenter and blacksmith who suggested iron and glass shutters on the alas, covering them, and decorations inspired by catalogs and shared photos. The second case of the Chali. Hussaina, a homemaker in her early 50s, lived with her husband and three daughters in the Ibrahim Nuruddin Chawl in Bindi Bazar until redevelopment in 2000, after which they moved to a building in Grant Road. Here, she sketched the chawl to suggest the type. I followed a similar method of gathering the field notes. The chawl in Bindi Bazar. The home they remember was the corner facing the street. एक अंदर का रूम था और एक बाहर का छोटा किचन और मेरा बेडरूम सामने था. That remained separated by the chali. During gatherings, they would eat together on a thal placed on the dastar khan. The house was always busy with many guests coming over since Saifi Masjid was nearby. Photographs suggest food being prepared in the chali during these times. She also remembers Dadi peeking through the lower bari to watch the chaos on the street. The galicha covered the hall since they had no furniture at first, only a few foldable chairs and jhula. The home served as a workspace when they didn't purchase the shop below. Redas, folding, cutting unfinished fabric, applying lace, initial work from home, foreign customers ki dawat, are the anecdotes. Then they moved to their 2 BHK apartment in Grant Road. Photographs from before the 2018 renovation reveal the importance of galicha, which restricted furniture and percolated floor mattresses for sleeping. They had multiple doors connecting all the rooms, allowing the children to run around all the time. However, privacy concerns led them to closing many doors at the same time, having them open only in the Charlie. The swing in Zahabia's room is removed to be a studio space. Elements from the chawl like the mori, galicha, takya, pathadi, lokhandu kabat further weave into the apartment's design along with bringing practices, squatting and chopping the vegetable despite having a kitchen platform, blurring the inhabitation of the type. The galicha and the Murphy bed juxtaposed each other to allow the tradition of eating on a dastarkhan on the floor post the renovation, leading to the softening. The third case of the Malyu looks at shift of home from a room in Bhuleshwar to 1 BHK Sari rented apartment. I'll just run through the drawings for this case. There was a matka wala for many years. Bane pasiti Ramesh uncle paisa nathi leta. She recalls, Malyu room no ek alaga anubhav che, as there were lofts on either side of the room. In the new home, awkward adaptations and associations of the old furniture take over the current flat. So the emerging argument is the type comes with certain aspirations as well as prescriptive and rigid forms of living, but memories of the remembered home allow the sheltered being blur the claim of the type and in doing so negotiates with the associated aspirations as well. The way in which memory constructs inhabitations in all these cases offers us to new ways to think about space itself as the whole house gets produced by these conflicts. The narrative, moments, and details that get held together, though in a fragmented manner, are the materials through which space gets constructed. The thesis argues for the newer methods of thinking about space beyond the idea of types, claims, and aspiration, but through the memories, small remembrances, anecdotes, and fragments of those spaces. Thank you.
The method of extending photographs, and we'll come to this whole idea of the home, like collection and storeroom, no, the storeroom idea of house or the home, because this is something that the photographs kind of make it very evident. The extended photographs become very evident, like the idea of a house across many, like we're doing these studies of housing across many cultures, has been a place to store things, not even to sleep but to store. And that house is actually, it's it's a way of uh, you keep kind of adding collected things, and then you find place to add more things and more things, and then the whole thing becomes one collage of which is the storeroom idea. And then what is interesting, and what is interesting is your extensions of the drawing kind of do that actually. So thanks, Aditi. Sinner to sinner.
Hello. So, my thesis titled is Garlela Saga Overlaps of Memory and Home. So, the idea of past home has always carried tangible and intangible associations with it. Growing up, I have heard countless stories from my family about their homemaking, their livelihood, and the shifts as if they are recollecting all the fragments of remembered home they have. When I think of my past home, I remember myself meandering through the small alleys of a dense cluster and looking through the windows of the houses around. In the recent years, along with the urbanized transformation, I've observed a shift in housing typologies that have emerged through a very different idea of home. Hence, the thesis acknowledges the role of memory of the past home by shifting from different typological houses in a similar context, asking how does spatial memory become a device to adapt the newer house types. So the study becomes an intensive observation of how people have been practicing homemaking historically, and the objective are to map how one remembers space and spatial transformation, to understand the patterns of dwelling and to conceptualize these shifts through type and aspirations. So the memory and space is a very well researched topic. Aldo Rossi argues in the chapter of architecture of the city that type can be operated through memory, which might be individual or collective, but it is to carry meanings, referring that the architecture and memory are linked to each other. and the type becomes an artifact to give physicality to the memory. In this accomplished literature, there is a relationship between space and memory. However, its implication on smaller scale and practices of living become a secondary aspect of them. Hence, the research aims to understand the part of homemaking practices to link memory and type. So, the site for the research is in Sinnar, which is a third-tier city of Maharashtra in Nasik district. Historically, people from different places have settled here for occupational purposes, as it was nearest to the city and it had many work opportunities. So the study focuses on households who have shifted to different typological houses or reconstructed their old one over different timelines. The study conceptualizes the stories of past to present homes and their way of adapting the newer typology. So the first case, a home as inherited memory. The couple had to move to Sinnar in search of work in 1974. Living in a chawl as their first home and then in a mercantile house as tenants, they narrate the house through the layers of transformations and extensions along each generation by each individual. पहाटेच्या दळणाला रात कुणाच्या वाड्यावरी मायलेकी दळतात सात खणाच्या माडीवरी. She remembers the Madi, which was a small terrace outside the kitchen, where she had spent most of her time. The shop, which had a long windows almost opening up to the street, and the thick walls with the niches. They curated a small garden in between that. The home was always in making through smaller additions, through smaller extensions. The shop, the shop had sprawled into living spaces by adding shelves to edges and to the corners, and the floor jali helped them communicate through the vertical communications. They say the house needed a lot of care. The walls needed to be plastered with mud and the roof needed to be arranged each year. This was a part of their routine, but as the house aged, it became difficult to maintain the house as a whole. So in 2007, their son decided to rebuild the house where they have been living for past 16 years. So as a mercantile house type, it always needs more space for interactions, storage, and showcase. The new house had a veranda where the visitors sit and the shop expands to the street. But over a period, the selling practices were carried to the living room. The storage was extended to the edges of all the bedrooms, staircases, and porches. At the same time, the spatiality of the corners hold the resting spaces for the family. And the kitchen, as an isolated space from the shop, becomes a space for family to gather. The terrace is a long, open space where he had curated a garden, as his father did in the courtyard, like a memory that he inherited growing up. So the house was transformed constantly on different scales and at different timelines. Even when the house was reconstructed, the type remained almost similar, as if it was engraved in their mind. It followed the logic of privacy that their older house had. The overlaps happens where the fenestrations become an important detail, as the consideration of smaller aspects like skylights, passages, and the shelves were carried from the past home to the present. This case hence argues that the affordance of each typology changes with each shift, but the routine within the past typology remains constant. Hence, the change in spatiality is adapted through the spatial memory, the memory that is formalized through their dwelling practices. The second case is a home as a milestone. This case is where a couple shifted to Sinnar in their earlier age in 1965. Having a government job, they had to move to different cities for it. Their remembrance of past homes happens through smaller instances and the shifts. They say, during these shifts, all we wanted was a large kitchen and a window and a balcony in our house. He had to leave the job in aspiration of settling. With, with a little money and a rented house, they decided to start a small restaurant in 1967. And their habit of seeking a large kitchen helped them with it. The house was very small for a family of 7 individuals, but they had made their own niches in it. Buying pieces of furniture and objects to shape the home was something they did during this. But the feeling of inferiority was always there for not having a house of their own. They bought the cheapest plot for around 5,000 rupees and constructed a room and a kitchen Being out of money midway, their friends insisted and lent them money to complete it. The new home had a huge open space, unpaved, but it was most efficient workspace for the hotel. But through this process, their children had always witnessed their parents to struggling, and their imagination of home was shaping throughout these years of making it. Their son hence decided to build a house on the outskirts. That period was when that area was considered as a developing area. So in 2016, he built an individual bungalow with all the things he felt missing in their old home, where they have been living currently. This house had separate space for each individual and also for family gatherings. So part of the house was kept for all the things from their past home, as their whole life was associated with them. And again, the kitchen was large, with 2 windows, as they always aspired for. The house for them is as a milestone they would spend the life for, but it is also a way of making it piece by piece. So the home was an assemblage of all the objects, of all the desires, arguing that the aspirational shift to having a good-looking house objectifies the ideas of home. But through this case, the argument of aspired home becomes more nuanced. Dwellers shape their homes through layers of social and communal aspects, and the normalized notions of society set a goal for them to achieve to have a dignified living. The case established the aspect through which the given typology is reconciled. Historically, housing has been a process of making. When the typology is given, it holds the imagination of the interlocutors, but the spatial nuances of their livelihood are layered as they inhabit it. In this case, the shift has happened from a house which had 2 large courtyards and a little living space to a 2 BHK apartment. Here, the typology of the house changes drastically. The type comes with a rigid boundaries and internal spatial segregation. But their idea of home was never between the spatial boundaries, and hence their homemaking practices and the routine of the past helped them to soften the given typology. So these arguments along the typology around affordances, aspirations, and degrees of privacy form a spatial patterns. The sense of home lies where the overlaps connects the present type to the past through memories, creating the spatial language. For example, uh, a house for joint family. The typology for that affords spaces for large gatherings, shared activities, and their everyday happens as a common. But it also has spaces for individual. Then uh, spaces spaces for elderly with the changing typologies and spatial segregation, the elderly find a space of their own, and they would occupy spaces near windows and near verandas. And then there are spaces for storage. So people carry object all the times as they shift, and the house needs a space to store these non-everyday objects. And there are patterns like terraces and open spaces, which becomes a nostalgic space for them, as it offers isolation from the house, creating a sense of privacy as well. So, in the current scenario of architectural intervention, a very high number of housing have been reconstructed or relocated in the past decade. These contexts are highly influenced by the city and its infrastructure. Knowing that this approach is only one of the way of looking at it, but as the spatial thinker, the shift needs to be understood through the livelihood, memories, and aspiration for a dignified space design. In the research, it becomes evident that the emphasized spatiality narrated through the memories has been removed completely in the newer typology, as they take an effort to retrofit them to smaller instances. But I ask, what happens to the absent memories, the spaces that are not translated along these shifts? Thank you.
Thanks. I think this panel is slowly trying to kind of construct for us the idea of the house and a home, and it's kind of building it up for us. And from the storeroom now, it's become a very, I mean, Aditi's managed to kind of locate it as an unstable, extending, changing, you know, improvising kind of a idea. I'm wondering, where does the hotel room, you know, idea of the house come from? You know, because current houses are all about making hotel rooms and putting hotel rooms together, tied up with a living space, which is a hotel lobby. But otherwise, I mean, these ideas of homes and houses are completely kind of, you know, are different, and uh, they they manage to kind of tie life in those different ways. Kushbu, take us to Sindh.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm Kushbu. The Pirwani and the Lalwani households migrated from Sindh to Jalgaon in 2012 and 2018 respectively. Women from these Sindhi households mentioned the restrictive conditions of life and the familial ties that made their households immigrate to Jalgaon. Even today, many Sindhi households continue to immigrate to India, as I am told that this year, Indore, another small city in Madhya Pradesh, has seen a huge influx of Sindhis. Partition is not a distant, but rather, as Siddiqui calls, a prolonged event in history. As these examples demonstrate, as a second generation individual born in a refugee household in Jalgaon, my recent interest lies in inquiring into the experiences of refugees who have experienced involuntary and often violent dislocation and have made their home here. While much of the existing literature around partition speaks about the narrative of loss, I draw upon a small body of literature that talks about the agency of refugees in making of home. The laptop. I ask how have Sindhi partition refugees made their home in the refugee colony of Kuwarnagar. My inquiry is situated in small cities because much of our experience of partition have come to us from metro cities. The examples that I cited of recent refugees coming in are happening in small cities. Kuwarnagar in Jalgaon was set up as a refugee colony by the central government in 1948. I entered the site with a framework of 7 key questions that explore the concept of loss, dislocation, experience of resettlement and rehabilitation, and shifts in the imagination of the spatial home, relational home, temporal home, and the material home. Christopher Alexander's diagrams in the book Pattern Language proved useful for me to document the stories that the Bill from of the refugee colony told me. Whereas Sudhir Patwardhan's aerial projection in his paintings Another Day in the City present an almost cartographic drawing of the city with its overlapping narratives of different scales, offering a dynamic interpretation of the city and the lives that inhabit it. This became a good reference for me to portray the stories of Kuanagar. During my visits to the site, I spent the day walking around the settlement, making friends, and listening to their stories. This eventually took a form of a set of short stories that together speak about the narrative of the thesis. I was born in Koti number 220 of Kuwarnagar itself. For the past 17 years, this very Koti is occupied by Savita and her family who moved to Jalgaon around 45 years ago. I sat on the chair across from her cot where she usually spends a day as she spoke. When we first arrived in India, we stayed with relatives for a while, then eventually rented a house in the settlement. My husband started a small shop in the market and I sewed clothes to help support the family. Savita recounted her life in Sindh. मर्दन जे हुजे करे जाइफन जी इज्जत लुटे वेंदा हुया. Men would harass women right in front of their husbands. Savita's voice tightened as she explained how unsafe Sindh had become for women. We couldn't even step out of our own homes after 6 p.m. They even killed my sister in law. That was the last straw. We couldn't stay there any longer. The house today structurally remains the same as the time my grandmother lived in it. Savita's larger part of this day is spent in sitting on her cot in the living room, where about 24 years ago, Kalyani used to sit. The cot had a straight line of view into the kitchen and its back door, the otak. Sheila has been living in the koti opposite to them for the past 50 years. This othak, now extended the threshold between the two kotis, had been instrumental in building ties between the women of this household since then. Today, this connected threshold offers a solace to Savita and Sheila during their daily evening get togethers. But it also was a space of refuge for Sheila when Kalyani lived here. Kalyani used to keep a watchful eye on Sheila's abusive husband through this threshold, and it became a sanctuary for the women when he was away. Sheila, after coming here from Avavati, was not able to get a koti because of the influx of the refugees coming in. She and her husband were part of many who then chose to squat on the edges of the colony, building their own homes. Ramesh Lula, who had been living in the colony for the last 67 years, considers himself one of the lucky ones who had been allocated a built koti. Nevertheless, he shares Sheila's sentiments regarding the poor infrastructures of the colony where the courtiers did not have direct access to water or toilet facilities in 1961. Well, there are many stories similar to Ramesh's about the lack of infrastructure, but what that has led to is a widespread effort by the refugees themselves to self develop institutions and enterprises to sustain them. One such initiative was the Seva Mandal, an institution set up by the community in 1965. Over the years, this institution, comprising of the members of the colony themselves, became a significant elective body in the colony and has a built temple, an old age home, and a community kitchen. A trust was also set up as a subsidiary to to care for these spaces. Ashok has been a part of this trust from the past 40 years, dedicatedly serving the community. For him, the space of his home extends beyond its koti and to the Seva Mandal and its spaces, where he spent most of his day. It provided Ashok with a sense of belonging. A community that is also a support system. So much so that post his surgery, Ashok and his wife temporarily moved to the trusted space and depended upon the community for care and support. Hence, the sense of home extends to the institution and isn't limited to the confines of the koti they were allocated. To sustain themselves in an unfamiliar city where work opportunities were scarce, the residents of Kuvarnagar began settling up small scale enterprises from within the confines of their kotis. When Danny Uncle came here in 1970, he began making sweets to sell in their 10 by 30 feet koti in the 10 by 30 feet koti where they lived, coming to be known as Rane Pedawala in the settlement. They made their sweets in the paddar or the courtyard, stored and packaged it in the rooms, and the kitchen was transformed to a small shop to sell them. As the family grew, the well established enterprise, which was a family business, now also expanded. The once 10 by 30 feet koti was now a 10 by 100 feet workshop for the enterprise, where the living arrangements remained constant. The home was now also a hub of production, a house of objects. This transformation, which is observed across numerous enterprises across the settlement, highlights a broader narrative of urban adaptation, where individual enterprises within the kotis gradually reconfigured the social and economic fabric of the settlement itself. The Kardas were allocated a koti number 255 when they first moved to Kuvarnagar from the Kalyan refugee camp in 1950. The story of displacement started by started becoming that of the settlement when they were fortunate enough to acquire koti number 170, a corner plot with plenty of open space around it, which made it valuable. With the growing family of the two brothers, they began claiming spaces around the koti and extending the boundaries of their home. The house that began as a 10 by 30 feet house, the cream colored koti with an expanded cement roof, typical of the area, is today a 20 by 60 feet family home covering an area of two kotis, a common living room, toilets, kitchen, and additional rooms built by claiming upon the open spaces around the koti. A friend of Sheila, Meena's mother, also claimed land on the outskirts of the colony to build her own home. Rani, a single mother who had lost her husband, became a cook for hire to support her family, cooking for all the community events that happened in the settlement and came to be known as Rani Roti Valley. With the help of Amma, a neighbor from the Koti number 200, Rani began constructing her home at the edge of the colony, piece by piece. Amma helped her demarcate the plot boundary using wooden partitions to mark and secure the space. The story reflects how the community's informal support systems enabled women like her to claim, adapt, and reimagine spaces as both homes and sources of livelihood. Now, Amma's Koti number 200, in comparison to its context, stood tall enough to be called a bangla. Her husband and his brother had reached Kuvarnagar after spending a year in the Devlali camp. On arriving in Jalgaon, they spent a lot of time navigating through the bureaucratic documents to file claims for their land lost in Sindh. But despite all their efforts, there were no reply. Eventually, losing hope and taking up loans, they had set up a small kirana store in the settlement to support themselves. The next generation was then able to expand the business by getting affordable Chinese goods from Singapore and Bangkok and selling it in the settlement. Soon, they established themselves enough and expanded to wholesale hosiery. As their financial stability increased, they continued to develop their kothis to reflect it and make a space for the growing family. The space of the two kothis now sits in Kuvarnagar as a bangla. Unlike Amma's stories, Mohini's family has moved away for work, leaving her kothi a quiet pared down space, she says, with her son, who's often away for work. In her late 60s, Mohini finds that her home extends into social ties that she has been able to build in the neighborhood. The migration of the younger residents is a common trend across the colony, leaving an aging community of first generation migrants who have developed intricate support networks. Durga, who lives in Mayakunj, has expanded her koti by merging it with the neighboring one, creating a space now shared with her granddaughter. The two rooms are linked by a doorway that connects Durga's room to her granddaughter's, transforming the koti into a space of mutual care and refuge. The reconfigured home now serves as a refuge, where Durga, in her old age, finds both a caregiver and a comforting presence in her granddaughter. All of these narratives uncover spatial patterns that people use to collectively generate their house and a sense of home within the colonies. These patterns become by employing strategies of extensions, spillovers, claims, boundary subversions, building of institution, social networks, and familial ties. These stories inform a series of questions about for a series of architectural questions about the spatial imagination in the design of resettlement and rehabilitation process. It also raises questions about the spatiality of built form in the refugee colonies that can be fruitful in observing the emerging contexts of homemaking. Thank you.
Of home, the idea of how home is actually a network, a community, a set of friendships, a set of alliances, enterprise, a whole series of things that Kushbu spoke about in making home actually. So thanks all three of you. The storeroom, uh, an unstable, continuously making entity, an entity formed from networks, uh, and the role of and you. I mean, you use memory almost as a tool to kind of open this idea for us, which is very nice. Thanks. So I'll invite either of you, Sonal or Kush, uh, to respond individually, collectively, the way you want. And then we have around 45 minutes for this session. So we'll have your responses, then their responses, and then we'll open up to everybody else.
Um, okay, thank you. Thank you, all three of you, Anika, Aditi, and Kushbu. I really enjoyed your all three of your presentations, and although the um, you have a common question of how memory is, uh, is one of the major actors in the new place where individuals move, all of you are looking at it very differently. And like particularly you're talking about the agency of a refugee, like when people move not because of choice, but because of some kind of I mean, it's against their will to move, and then they are allocated plots that this is how you will, live. And so, what agency do they extend to create that space which is feasible for themselves? And it's very interesting how you are bringing strategies and tactics people employ to make that plotted property their own, like strategies of subversion, extensions, and so on and so forth. It was very enjoyable, and particularly, like, I was very happy to see Anuradha Siddiqui, and I think in conversation with Rohan, because she's recently brought out a book also on refugees, architecture of migration, where she's doing intensive interviews and like how people create. And similarly, along the same lines, these mercantile families that move, that is more aspirational, and so they have like a little bit more control over what they carry with themselves. And then also they have access to resources, maybe in terms of how they can keep keep the objects. And similarly, in your case, I think it was, if I'm not wrong, it's like an aspirational move from one part of the world to the other, and not out of force. So this memory, what I also see in all three of you is based on objects. Like how memory works is very personalized. Like we can't have access to anybody else's memory. We can only have access to it through, through these things, artifacts, or objects, which maybe they also are putting to remember themselves, but also to signify this is what we remember. And so it becomes like a little entry into their personal lives through the artifacts, like the alas and the swing. I don't know if the swing was carried from uh, swing was, I think in your case, like it's coming from their hometown or not, I don't know, but it just reminded me of an anecdote, if I may. So a friend of mine, she moved from Sagar, and Sagar is like a very Madhya Pradesh, like a small town, and slow, sleepy, beautiful, and now she's in the thick of very dense neighborhood, and she has like now acquired high an apartment in the high rise. She insisted to get that swing, which just the swing, just the patta. There was like nothing, no hanging. She said, I want to have that swing because that's where I spend my childhood. Now, the childhood, when she put that swing in this apartment, the things that would hold the swing were different. But when she was in Sagar and she would sit on the swing, what she would be swinging was a very different environment. And as a child, she would lay down and look at the sky. Here, the change of the object, the scale, because now she's a grown up person, the scale is changed of using the swing. And also, she cannot no longer lie and look at the sky because it's a ceiling. So we carry objects with us, but then the objects also keep transforming. They also acquire a new life of their own in the new setting. And I think in that way, all of your projects have been describing about the new life that those things and memories start to take on. And especially in your case, it almost seems a presentation of what it is today, like totally detached from what it was completely. So it starts to acquire a new life. That was very, very good. I'll come back. I have more thoughts, but I'll like maybe have either you respond or maybe Kush, you could like take it forward from here.
I mean, I agree on the object, like the way you say that the objects are then carried forward and then they have a new life. In my case, it has been 75 years since people have moved from Sindh, and some of the objects are still fine. So I found a plate that they were able to carry from Sindh, and now they are using this plate for any name giving ceremony that happens in settlement. So I mean, this new sort of a life of the object itself also takes place.
And also the idea of continuity, that it is just not in the present, but then there are these traces which are being carried on, and then the same objects with the newer meanings which are getting projected on it because of the new aspiration that they have. So it forms something else altogether.
Also, as you said, the story of your friend when she wanted to buy the swing, as the memory was associated with her childhood. But in these cases, it is kind of opposite, because in their childhood they didn't had resources or the space to have the swing, but their memories were still associated with it because they were not able to have that. But when growing up, uh, their association was still there, and the objects were shaped through.
Um, no, thank you. I do want to echo Sonal and sort of, commend all three of you, um, Anika, Aditi, and Kushbu, for excellent ways of thinking with drawings and really honing in on the question of memory. I think just sort of a close focus on the question of memory has yielded such different ways of thinking about contexts and then thinking of what and how of your own inquiries will move from here. So I do want to commend you on that. Um, One of the ways in which I was also thinking across these three projects is how you have represented and the kind of methods that you have used for your individual research. Um, so Anika, for you, I could see a kind of an album, that begins to emerge as a very strong form in how you are thinking about the context of text and image memory. Um, with Aditi, there is, with this idea of continuities and temporalities, it almost, your drawing form becomes like an endless scroll in both directions. And that has its own language of affordances and routine. And Kushbu, yours becomes, for me, kind of a distorted grid. And a distorted grid because you rely very heavily on a given infrastructure. And then what happens to that infrastructure once it's inhabited with certain kinds of memory. So I'm thinking across these three forms, the album, the scroll, and a distorted grid as a kind of a visual method to think of the question of memory and inhabitation. And that's just helping me conceptually think more uniquely about each of your cases, but also draw parallels and distinctions between them. That's one observation. The other observation I had was how, of course, you're united in this question of how memory informs inhabitation and how that transforms through time. And I'm curious, and I want to put on the table this question of how inhabitation also shapes a certain kind of memory and the telling of a certain kind of a story. So how to avoid this kind of a linear correlation between memories as one lives with them and then sort of see what happens to inhabitation, but also how might current forms of inhabitation inform how they are telling you the story of what that memory might be. So how to destabilize the question of memory as opposed to it being a finite thing that you have stored in your body and moved with that body. But I'm just sort of opening up this question of how memory is also quite unstable and hence quite creative and possible for imagining different kinds of futures. I'm also curious about the relationship of the researcher and the researched. So what was the relationship of the contexts that you have studied in each of you? If we could speak a little bit about that, because that gives you access to certain kinds of stories, homes, memories, and who gets to share with whom and to what extent. So if you can reflect on that, that would be helpful. Um, and I also want to sort of invite you to think about memory as being much larger, right? Our memories are so much more larger than, so even in the context of a home, how we inhabit a given corner or a particular room is not just about what happens within those four walls and what continues to transform within those four walls, but also what happens to us in the worlds that we continue to move through. So how might you enlarge the question of memory to bring a much broader understanding of these people, the worlds that they have lived in, to be able to, again, suspend the idea of memory as located in a particular form or ascribed to a particular time period. That is something of a question for you. And last but not least, return to something that I've always come back to, the idea of deep subjectivities, and how the question of not just subjectivities, I often say deep subjectivities because that is both synchronous, what's happening in real time, but also diachronous, what's happened across time, and then how it's structural, meaning things that have stayed constant, but things that have also begun to sort of evolve and open up this question of memory, however difficult they may be, but they still carry the potential for us to inhabit new worlds. So world making, the connection between deep subjectivities and homemaking or world making is something that I want to think with each of your projects. So yeah, there's a series of observations, but you could pick any of them to begin to reflect. But thank you.
Interrelated things that he's speaking about. First, the method of drawing, the outgrowth, the scroll and the distortion. I mean, identifying in each of them, like how does it kind of, where did it come from? How does it help you to kind of think? Uh, the the question of the dialogical relationship between memory and habitation, both making each other, not one making the other. You know, they're constant, they're unstable, and your relation with the subjects. Subject is an interesting thing. It's not an object relation. It's a subject. You enter yourself via the subject. Right? So it's a and and how they are. I mean, this is Kush's term actually. Deep subjectivity. How does it kind of work with the world making, home making enterprise? Any responses to any of them? And even tying up the earlier question of objects and the role of objects in making, you know, in in putting together the home or house or the world for you.
I'll start. So, firstly, answering the question of the relationship of the researcher and the research. So, I am the site that I took. I was born in that colony. So the access that I had in that colony was a lot. Even when you go through the narratives, I was able to get richer narratives of the violence, of of the personal violence that the women were going through when they were in sin. So all of this happened because of my access to the colony. And I also tried to include the subjects, even my family subjects, in the narratives when I talked about my grandfather Kalyani, who used to keep an eye on Sheila's house because Sheila's husband was abusive. So the smaller sort of things that happened. So one is that, and then the other thing you asked was the distortion as a method for the drawing, and that happened because I wanted to speak about the colony as a whole, because in my findings it comes out as the home is not happening in the individual unit of the koti. It extends beyond the boundaries of the koti, and that is why the colony becomes important. And to give a gist of the whole colony, I tried to make a stitched drawing, which gives you an idea of what the urban fabric of the colony is. Um, and again, coming back to the questions of memories, I'm not. I mean, memories in my case were very distant. because of the time duration. Because in both of these cases, we see that the you know the migration is recent and is it also a choice. In my case, people have tried to get themselves to erase those memories, and even the memories associated were kind of something that they associated with violence, so they were not really speaking about these memories very fruitfully, or I mean, because the memories were not associated with happiness maybe. And on again on opening up the idea of the deeper subjectivities. So what is happening in these colonies in the past 75 years, kind of I open up that the whole urban fabric of the colony is getting changed, but also the urban fabric of the city is getting changed, because now the newer generations have this aspiration of moving out of the colony because they don't want to be associated with the idea of a refugee colony, and they're trying to move out of the colony, making a space for them in the outskirts of the city, in the peripheries of the city, and that sort of changes the urban fabric. And I think it also opens up for us in the recent, because I start the presentation with the fact that the migration is still happening because people are still coming in from Sindh. So it pushes us to think of an architecture for the aftermath of displacement. Thank you.
Yeah. So the relationship of the researcher and the research and the researcher here, while I was going to their homes, initially I would sit with that notebook, and while we used to talk, the notes later when I reflected on them, they were very fragmented, wherein the plan was itself abstraction. So if I was trying to come and draw a complete plan, that was not able to hold what they were suggesting. But then those notes became very important because that suggested the nature of how they remembered the home. So this in turn, the method of taking those notes uh, and also them writing over the photographs is then unfolding in the way it gets drawn. So that is the relationship between the two. And also what happens to the way memory is constructed in space, and then the inhabitation in itself is, projecting the memory. Uh, so the here the idea of the type being a relationship between space, it establishes this relationship between certain forms of living. However, in the new home, their associated aspiration with that type sort of changes the way that these newer meanings are getting are being created. So yeah.
So one of the cases that I presented was from my family, where my grandparents have shifted from different households. And when I talked to my grandmother, she was not talking as if this was my first home and it had this. It was like a continuity of memory, and she would mix up all the houses. And hence, also while drawing it out, it was difficult for me because uh, it was not possible to draw it in plans or sections, or I didn't know what a particular type looked like. But there was similarities in each of the houses, like the kitchen and the way she aspired for one of the cases. And also currently, so she has carried all of those objects, but not necessarily all of our family members wants those. They have not the similar kind of association with them, and hence there is a constant back and forth in what to keep and what to not, and that also kind of shapes the way each individual from a household shape their home. And also to answer the world of memory, it's very huge, but I think. Along with these smaller instances, I think the social and cultural aspects that each interlocutor had help them help not help, but they shape their aspirations in some ways.
Yeah, thank you for the response, and thank you, Kush, like for initiating this conversation about your relationship with the project. And I think I think that makes the project very special because of the associations and the access that you have to that information. I just wanted to like extend that conversation that the memory is never like something very, very absolute. Hmm? We never remember things completely. It's only in bits and pieces. And so every time you ask your grandmother or you know your grandmother and like, okay, tell me about that time, and so there will be always like something that has shifted, and that shift keeps on like shifting, and there is a certain blurriness that is there to that memory, which is very beautiful in the sense like, it's never complete. And I don't know, somehow when you were describing in your question, it just like brought my attention to the drawing, the representation, that there is like something which is very incomplete and very also a sense of fragmentation in the way you've represented, which aligns with the way which also like subverts the very formalist way of representing architecture, which is like very deterministic. This is what it is, because the memory itself is so evasive, and so your drawings are trying to do that. Like somewhere it's text, somewhere it's symmetry, somewhere it's a collage, somewhere the lines are broken. So I don't know, I there is some relationship in the way you all three of you are representing, and the blurring evasiveness of the memory, which is very powerful. I don't know, like, I mean, you've already answered that question of representation, like it was coming from your field notes and things like that. But even the way you draw, was that intentional? And just to add to, I think I'll just leave it here because there's a lot of questions that I have. Um, but it's just, see, one thing that I want to always bring to the table. Like when you think about memory, the memory is something which happens in the brain, but it's coincidental. I don't know. When I came to know about it, was also a shock to me. It's not something that we think we can tell our brains and say that we can remember, but no, it's not. It's coincidental. It's the synaptic electrons are like coinciding into a synaptic medium, and when those things collide at the say together, then we remember something that happened. It has to be a similar kind of a collision. I don't know how that works. Huh? And it's related to the everything, the tongue and the nose. It's connected to the memory. But can you remember the smell of a rose right now? But you know it, no? But you can't remember it. Huh? You can only or you can only remember also once you smell it. So what we call the it's called the mnemonic device, a device that helps you remember. Hmm? And so all these artifacts that you're talking about, no, the artifact like the objects that you carry or the alas, and they are all mnemonic devices that help you remember. And I don't know why I'm going on, but I just wanted to respond to your thing that something which is very personalized becomes public. So something which is a very personalized memory can only become a shared memory through objects. Hmm? So, and that is because that is the mnemonic device. And then the mnemonic device is not intended for everybody to remember the way it had to be remembered. The mnemonic device allows you to remember the way you want to remember. And that's the beauty. That's where his question of how does the thing now change the memory? Because the memory is, it's evasive. It's always going to change. Your memory for that object, for that receipt that you showed, will be very different from your grandfather's. And so, but it becomes shared because it has acquired a status of a mnemonic device. So thank you for bringing all these things. And if you would like to respond to this, it's like, we're very happy to hear.
So your point about the collision that takes place, that's true. Like memory, it will reveal itself in a moment. Also, like it comes from the readings of Proust, wherein it is not a very cerebral thing, but then it gets revealed, and then therefore it gets materialized within the space, which was evident in a few of these moments. And then the idea of it's memory not being a personal thing but a shared device. So it is it was therefore not residing in an individual, but it was materialized within that collective experience of the space. So the nature, although it gets lost along the way, but then it's somewhere recreated in the new homes as well. So yeah.
I, I mean, I'm sorry if I'm talking about my own narrative, but so when you're talking about the coinciding of memories, and in one of my stories, I was talking to Durga, who's now, she was traveling when she was 6 years old, and she came from Sindh to India. And when I asked her about, what are your experience of partition, she told me that, oh, I don't remember anything. I was six then. And then slowly, we spent an hour and a half, where she described me the whole, okay, I went from Ubrao to Karachi, and then I went to got a camp in Ulhasnagar. But after a few months, I went again to, back to Sindh. But since the violence was ongoing, I came back. So we shifted again and got a space in Chaliskau camp. And then I was married and moved to Jalgaon. And then even in the conversation, she was speaking like, and she's talking to me about something very, about my daily life. And then suddenly she goes like, oh, I remember seeing dead bodies in Mirpur. It was Akbar. Oh no, I think it was Mirpur. And it can't be Mirpur because Mirpur is in Kashmir. So I'm sure it was not Mirpur. But the memories were shifting, and she was trying to remember, something in that. And the question of mnemonic device, and I think it's something very important for me to think through of what this device is for me. And I think the collective memory for Sindhis is the event of the partition itself, because I think that event sort of shaped their narrative of the violence of, and because it's not a individual history of migration. It's a, people came together, and it's a collective sort of history. So, but I think I would still think about your question of the mnemonic device and what that is. Thank you.
As Kushbu said, that the memory uh, so while I was talking to the people on my field, they, matlab, they didn't had they didn't know that these memories are very important. Like when I started the conversation, they were like, "Yeah, that was our home." But they opened up the conversation. When the conversation was opened up, the whole family gathered, and they were each, as you said, each the same memories was remembered in very different way. They would remember a different detail as the others. So I think it's not the memory could be same, but it's very subjective that what one remembers and what other.
Um, there was something that I wanted to, again, continue to build upon this conversation is, there is a certain heaviness to each of your projects and your drawings, because you're talking about very specific memories in very specific contexts. There's a certain weightedness to that project because you're interested in this question of memory and inhabitation and life and personality. I'm sort of inviting you to sort of think about creating space for fictional um, tellings and retellings of who we have been, where we have been, and how we might continue to live where we want to live. So because we are saying, if we suspend the idea of memory as something that has happened in the past, something which is static or something which can be inferred on and off, where is the room for fictional tellings and retellings in each of your stories? So another way to sort of think about continuity in each of your methods to draw is then how might you layer it and create room for fictional retellings, which then becomes transformative as an architectural project, as an architectural device. Because then there is a room for then what happens to memory as it's also transformative, both experientially, but also as a subjective index and as a design method. Um, and the other thing that I wanted to sort of invite all of us to think about is perhaps think about, there's a lot of talk on space, right? There's a spatial representation, things connected to how space has evolved. But what if we begin to theorize memory time? Just suspend this idea of time as may have happened in clock time, but then what might constitute memory time? And if we begin to theorize what is memory time, then what is the resultant spatial articulation? Because in each of your methods, the first one was very much like a photo elicitation. You had a series of photographs, and then that elicited a kind of memory which people wrote upon. The second one was a series of stories. And the third one was very, set of questions. So there is a certain kind of a method to thinking and eliciting the memories of these individuals. And whilst they have yielded the stories that they have yielded, as you move towards thinking of the role of architecture, the role that architecture and space might begin to play, is to then also begin to theorize time in relationship to memory, and maybe come up with this new conception of memory time. And then again, fiction, role of fiction in all of this storytelling.
Very exciting provocation of thinking fiction. I just want to respond to that before you guys come in. Now, because I think, see, how I read it is like what they told is fiction. Because, see, technically, if memory is evasive, and if every time I ask my grandmother, the story will be different. If I'm telling my own experience of something, it will be different. And when you wake up from a dream, and if you are one of those individuals who kind of have vivid dreams and you tend to remember and tend to write it down, like, you will realize that half the time you're forcing yourself to complete the story because you don't remember everything. And in the completing of the story, you unintentionally fictionalize a large part of it. It's very difficult to, like, so the translation of that is where your agency lies, agency of the people, and so I think is yeah, yeah, yes, yeah.
So yeah. No, this is great. I mean, if honestly, if you're thinking of it, and if you're rereading your own work as a set of fictional narratives, how to then revisit the drawing as not invoking a certain kind of settled narrative retelling of history. So it's an interesting conversation for you to continuously invite yourself into as you're thinking of your own drawing and method. Yeah.
Thank you for the lovely presentations and the rich conversation that has happened after the presentations. I have a comment and a question, both. And it's open to everybody. It's not kind of directed. In opening the discussion, Sonal brought out one of the commonalities between all of the presentations is that they're working or narrating memory through objects, and then built on that through the idea of mnemonic devices. I'm wondering, just to kind of connect it to what Kush kind of brought about, thinking of the method of the narrative over here, album scroll and the distorted grid. I'm wondering if something that holds all of them together? Is it the idea of the fragment? And if the fragment is a method to kind of research, does the fragment also have speculative or projective capacities? Can it also be kind of, thought through in terms of the projective capacities of design? And here I'm kind of trying to think through some of the architects who kind of used the, the notion of fragment as a method, the work of, in terms of design, Hans Hollein or, who's the other American architect? I just, um, Hans Hollein and I forget the other one. But the idea of the fragment, does it have projective capacities? And how can that be mobilized in ways of thinking about design? Especially when Anika points out, type is not as restrictive at this as it sounds to be. So can the fragment be mobilized in terms of its projective capacities? The second point that I have want to bring about is, I mean, while you all narrated your kind of work through stories of objects, spaces, I mean, can you all kind of, look back upon your work? Can you look back upon your work and push the narratives? I mean, because this question of fiction kind of has come up over here. Can you push your narratives? Or talk a little bit about what kind of analogies, metaphors, or concepts do they bring out? Okay, the stories, but do they bring out concepts that have emerged for you very strong in conceptualizing these narratives? So, is there a conceptual thrust? And so, what are they hinged around? What kinds of concepts are they hinged around? All of these narrative motifs in your work. I mean, this is the last discussion on fiction. Kind of reminded me also of Kirin Narayan's work on the relationship between fiction and ethnography. That is simply two different modes of kind of narrating work, but they share so many affinities that one cannot really distinguish where the boundary really lies.
So, your last point, wherein pushing these narratives to talk a little bit about the concepts. So, the blurring of the type that takes place, those concepts could be like, which was in the new home, certain spatial practices that continue, then which, and also the conflicts, because there is a conflict between the memory and the aspiration, which materializes in form of something, and also like the semantics wherein they are using the same names but associating a different meaning to it, wherein they continue to call it an ala, but they now want the ala covered with the kiwards and then something of that sort. They continue calling it a chali, but the nature is different. The Malyu now, which only has, could only store certain things, but which somewhere a person used to sleep there or eat there. So then even that is something that brings along with time.
Rohan, your question about the object, the capacity of the object to have a projective, uh, the fragment, yeah, sorry, the fragment having a projective capacity, and the invitation to use that as a medium to design something. Um, I feel like I think the conversation as at some point will leave the domain of the individual or a personalized memory to become either a shared or something shareable memory, because then it also, when we are talking about our practice and we come back to the field, to our discipline, then sometimes the one who designs maybe designing for somebody else's memory, And so the distance between a person's memory and getting translated to somebody who designs it, there is then a distance. And that has to be navigated. And then the fragments capacity will definitely come into play. So it reminds me of, so it again comes back to the point that, you know, it ends up being like an object which either triggers or sustains or like, you know, just basically, I think it just triggers memory. So it reminds me of this project by an artist, Muhammad Hafiz, a Syrian artist who did this suitcase project. It's a very interesting. It's a baggage, refugee baggage. It's called Unpacked. Huh? You can look. It's unpacked. So it's the Syrian refugees moving across places. What he does is that he collects a lot of suitcases, and in, those suitcases become dioramas of what people take, um, what people leave behind, not they take away with them, but because it's what got left behind is in the suitcase, which can be taken away, uh, is very provocative, because what gets left behind were bombed houses and things like that. So he creates these dioramas with, you know, incomplete interiors of spaces which are like totally opposite of what you guys are doing. It's like carpets with tea spilled over because it's in the aftermath of somebody who just left their home in a hurry. And so he recreates those things in a suitcase which can be taken away. So you're taking away that moment with you. And then you recreate. So, like, what are the things that tangibly you are able to take? It's not like you take those away, but he's trying to mediate that distance between what we have in mind and what we can tangibly take away, kind of thing. So,
I mean, just adding on to this, I mean, in my case, when, you know, packing that bag, people took the object that were necessary, and what got left behind were the object of desires. So now, when you pack that bag of the home of sin, you will see the object of desires that are left behind, and all the
About space not as something that is contained, but sort of becomes expansive. Uh,
I mean, just I want to add something to that. I mean, when I kind of brought out the notion of fragments, I mean, I was actually thinking about um, Bell Hook's work on home as resistance. So the projective dimension of the fragment was to think of the home as a space of resistance, that the idea of resistance not in a negative connotation, but resistance to kind of, you know, certain kinds of erasures that are being made. How does the practice of making or remaking of memories in some of these spaces lend to kind of acts of design itself? And whether then that is the act of the projection of the projective capacity in the fragment. So in that sense.
Two things extending from the conversations that you've had here. One is this idea of how do you mobilize memory? You know, like memory as memory is often seen as nostalgia, like this idea of something that one has to hold on to. But there are many things that have come out here. The idea of memory as also forgetting, in Kushbu's case, because I mean there's a certain kind of forgetting that is as important as remembering, or this idea that you kind of mobilize memory not as an individual but as a kind of form of the collective, um, and also this idea of I think the sensorium, that you discussed, like this idea that often, and this is something that one has to also think about, like, because the drawings are really strong, but the drawings also hold a certain kind of visuality, you know but memories are, when Bruce talks about this act of remembrance and the idea of the smell or of Madeline's cookie, that that suddenly a taste reminded you of some place. How do we look, because that's something that you all ended up with, right? Like, how do you extend the logics of space beyond the notions of a cartographic idea of space, beyond its kind of hardness, but this idea of soft space? So how do we really kind of also bring in this idea of the sensorium? What does it mean to draw sensorium, right? So I think that there's certain kinds of discussions here that will be useful to project your own thinking from, right? Like, what does it mean to then think of the sensorium as a way of drawing, or a way of thinking of space? And the other is the various ways of mobilizing memory, nostalgia, forgetting, the idea of the collective. But I don't know, there may be many ways of thinking of what it means to think of mobilizing memory, and that is something that will be useful for us to think about collectively.
Anybody else? I just, I mean, I thought of memory as a historicizing tool, no? Like, it's useful to use it as an apparatus to historicize. And why historicize? To interrogate it. And because then you kind of, locate yourself and stuff like that. And of course, we spoke about so many dimensions of using it as a tool. No, man, uh, the it being unstable, it being hinged around objects, it being operationalized only in a collective, like what you said, Aditi, or it being operationalized through an object, through a phenomena, through a instance, etc. So I think I mean, methodologically, it's a very rich, panel actually. It's a rich panel, as well as so many possibilities from here on, and the whole idea of fiction, and then you know, uh, uh, Sonal's kind of provocation that it was all fictional. Of course, it's all fictional, as well as like the difference between non-fiction and fiction doesn't occur actually. It's unimportant almost, because it's so I think as a historicizing device, it's a very useful kind of an entity, and I think they all struggled with kind of mobilizing it as a historicizing device, and then I think in various degrees. But what is again what is interesting again is the way they've opened up the idea of home and house for us. It's kind of, or inhabitation for us. That how does it happen? How does it work out? And and then really pushing us to kind of rethink uh, how do we kind of otherwise think of space, or spatiality. I think that's a very important thing. And of course, one thing I want to highlight is this whole idea of which Kushbu brings out very clearly, this idea of violence, no, the violence of actual violence that you feel, but also through the violence of displacement, the question of erasure, whether violence is an erasure or a marker, so all of those dimensions. So thanks, unless there are anybody else. Kirat, why are you here? So, so, uh, uh, so thanks. Very, very nice, very interesting panel. It's 1:10. We'll meet at 2. We'll meet at 2 for the next panel. This is a very nice beginning. Yeah.